Here's a fact that flips everything you thought you knew about time. When Cleopatra was born, the pyramids were already ancient history to her, roughly as distant as Stonehenge feels to us today. More time passed between the Great Pyramid's construction and Cleopatra's birth than has passed between Cleopatra and today's rocket launches into orbit. She lived closer in time to humans landing on the moon than to the pyramids she supposedly loved to stroll around. How did we manage to compress thousands of years of Egyptian history into one flat picture of camels and pyramids?
Today we're breaking down 35 of the most persistent myths about Egypt, from who actually built the pyramids, to which way the Nile flows, to Cleopatra's real ethnicity, to whether modern Egyptians are related to the pharaohs at all, to what really happened during the Suez Crisis and the 2011 revolution. Some of these myths were born in antiquity, when Greek and Roman travelers, running into a culture they didn't understand, filled the gaps with mystical explanations. Herodotus himself dead seriously retold the legend of the phoenix flying to Egypt's temple of the sun every 500 years to burn its dead parent's body in incense and be reborn. While admitting he personally doubted the story but figured curious readers deserved to hear it anyway. Some myths came from Hollywood movies and 19th century tabloid press, happily printing the wildest tales about the mysterious East for a sensation-hungry public that had never set foot in Egypt and had no way to check any of it. And some of it, surprisingly, Egypt cultivates itself because mystery sells tickets better than dry archaeological reports. We've split today's 35 myths into 6 thematic blocks: the great monuments, religion and everyday life, geography and economy, the long-forgotten centuries after the pharaohs, and finally, the turbulent 20th century. To show that Egypt is a lot more complicated than one postcard silhouette of a pyramid. For every myth, we'll follow the same structure: what the popular belief actually claims, where it came from historically or culturally, and what archaeology, genetics, and written sources actually show. Let's start at the beginning, with the pyramids.
Myth number 1. The pyramids were built by slaves, driven onto the site by the thousands under the whip in the blazing sun, then ruthlessly killed off once construction wrapped up. This image is so deeply baked into pop culture thanks to mid-20th century Hollywood epics that it's become practically synonymous with the word pyramid itself. But archaeological digs over the past 30 years, including the discovery of an entire workers' town near the Giza Plateau with bakeries, breweries, and residential quarters, plus builders' cemeteries there with burials befitting respected community members rather than slaves, have completely overturned the scientific consensus. Most Egyptologists today agree the main workforce wasn't enslaved people, but hired peasant farmers working seasonally during the Nile's flood when field work was impossible anyway, with the state providing food, beer, and medical care in exchange for labor, a kind of national labor levy that gave farmers income and food during the off-season. Skeletons found at the site show clear signs of hard physical labor, spinal and joint deformities typical of people carrying heavy loads, but also healed fractures, pointing to medical care rarely available to enslaved people in other ancient cultures. Inscriptions and graffiti on the building blocks themselves reference work crew names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure. Joking, buddy-style nicknames that people in forced bondage, stripped of any pride in their own labor, would hardly have given themselves. The slave myth stuck around largely thanks to the biblical account of the Israelites' exodus from Egyptian slavery, which historically belongs to a completely different, much later era than the Giza pyramids, falling a good 1,000 years after their construction, according to biblical chronology itself. The famous Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, was already retelling local legends of cruel overseers. But he was never an eyewitness, just recording oral traditions that modern archaeology, with far more direct physical evidence, largely disproves. The workers' village discovered by archaeologist Mark Lenner included bakeries capable of producing bread on an industrial scale, and cattle bone remains showing builders were fed meat, a diet completely atypical for slaves in the ancient world. Myth number 2. The pyramids are so technically advanced that Bronze Age people couldn't have built them, so aliens, Atlanteans, or some other vanished advanced civilization must have been involved. This pseudo-archaeological theory remains surprisingly persistent despite the fact that modern science has thoroughly documented the real building techniques. There are surviving depictions and remnants of the ramps used to haul blocks up, quarries with half-cut blocks still stuck mid-extraction, and in 2013, remarkably well-preserved papyri were found in caves along the Red Sea coast. Diaries kept by a work crew under a foreman named Mirror, describing in detail the logistics of moving limestone blocks along specially dug canals during the Nile's seasonal flood. The earliest known inscribed papyri from Egypt, dating directly to the Great Pyramid's construction. Egyptologists and engineers have repeatedly run experiments reconstructing the process using nothing but Bronze Age tools, convincingly demonstrating its feasibility with tens of thousands of coordinated workers over roughly 20 years, a figure backed independently both by Herodotus, citing Egyptian priests, and by modern engineering calculations, with the required annual construction pace turning out comparable to building a major cathedral in medieval Europe, which also took decades and raises nobody's suspicions of alien help. Theories about aliens or Atlantis, however popular in tabloids and pseudoscience channels, have zero archaeological backing and, more importantly, by their very existence quietly diminish the real engineering and organizational achievements of the ancient Egyptians, as if Bronze Age civilization couldn't have pulled this off without outside help. In 2022, an international team used radar scanning to find the remains of an ancient Nile branch and lock system right at Giza's foot, finally confirming that heavy blocks were mostly moved by water, not dragged for miles overland the way popular reconstructions often show it.
Myth number 3. The pyramids sit deep in an endless desert, far from any civilization, reachable only by camel after days of travel across dunes. Reality is a world away from this romantic image. The Giza Plateau, with its 3 main pyramids and the Sphinx, sits practically on the edge of modern Cairo, one of the world's biggest megacities, whose metro area tops 20 million people, making Greater Cairo not just Egypt's largest city, but one of the largest urban areas on the entire African continent. And you can taxi from downtown to the pyramids in half an hour. Plenty of tourists, seeing photos for the first time, are genuinely shocked that residential towers, a KFC, and billboards sit right on the horizon behind the pyramids. Cairo's sprawl pushes right up against the ancient necropolis, and the rooftop of one nearby fast food restaurant offers such a perfect pyramid view that the place has become an unofficial tourist attraction in its own right, regularly mentioned in guidebooks precisely for this bizarre juxtaposition of antiquity and modern fast food. The contrast is striking enough to have spawned countless internet memes.
The reason the pyramids were built here in the first place is fairly practical. The site sits at the border of the fertile Nile Valley and the desert plateau the stone was quarried from, close enough to the ancient capital Memphis for easy supply logistics. Today, the boundary between desert and city is drawn so literally that in some spots, the paved road simply ends at the foot of the sandy plateau, and residents of nearby neighborhoods see the pyramids right out of their own apartment window. Myth number 4. The Sphinx's famous missing nose was blown off by a cannonball from Napoleon's soldiers during his 1798 Egyptian campaign, supposedly used for target practice out of boredom. This myth is completely disproven by basic chronology. Sketches and traveler accounts dated long before Napoleon was even born already show the Sphinx without a nose. A 1737 drawing by the Danish traveler Frederick Louis Norden, half a century before Napoleon arrived in Egypt, clearly shows the statue already damaged, and some researchers point to even earlier 14th century Arabic sources describing the Sphinx as already noseless. The most credible historical account ties the loss to a deliberate act of vandalism by a Sufi sheikh named Muhammad Saim al-Dar, who, according to medieval Arabic chronicles, defaced the monument because he was outraged that local farmers kept leaving pagan offerings for a good Nile flood, seeing it as idolatry incompatible with Islam. Legend has it, furious farmers later lynched the sheikh for destroying the landmark, possibly the origin of the Sphinx's Arabic name, Abu al-Hol, literally, father of terror, though linguists still debate the exact origin. Worth adding one more detail that shatters the romantic image further. The Sphinx's entire body, not just its face, was originally painted in bright colors. Traces of red ochre on the face and remnants of blue and yellow pigment on the body have survived in spots protected from erosion, meaning the monument once looked far more colorful and, by modern standards, almost gaudy than the plain sandy stone we're used to.
Myth number 5. The curse of the pharaohs is a real mystical force, and everyone involved in opening Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 mysteriously died soon after. This became a genuine worldwide sensation, thanks largely to the British tabloid press, which pounced on the story after Lord Carnarvon, who financed Howard Carter's expedition, died just months after the tomb was opened. Carnarvon really did die of blood poisoning after nicking a mosquito bite while shaving. But that kind of death, before antibiotics were widely available, was completely unremarkable.
Carnarvon also already had weak health after a serious car accident that had led doctors to originally recommend the warm Egyptian climate as therapy, so his body was compromised long before that unlucky bite. A statistical analysis run by modern researchers found that of the 58 people present at the tomb's initial opening, the overwhelming majority lived for decades more. Howard Carter himself, who led the dig and was first to enter the burial chamber, died 17 years later at 64 of ordinary lymphoma. The average age of death among expedition participants was statistically no different from people of their generation and social standing generally. Carter himself, for the rest of his life, publicly mocked curse talk as a fabrication cooked up by sensation-seeking journalists, and stressed he never once encountered anything supernatural in all his years in the tomb. The curse legend proved so commercially irresistible that it spawned an entire genre of Hollywood mummy movies, which in turn only cemented the myth further in the minds of generations who knew nothing of the real statistic. Myth number 6. Closing the first block on the Great Monuments, the Great Pyramid is the only real pyramid in Egypt, and everything else is just a smaller, later copy. In reality, Egypt has more than 100 surviving pyramids, built over several centuries by different pharaohs from different dynasties, evolving significantly in shape, size, and technique over time. The very first true pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, predates the Great Pyramid of Giza by almost a century and looks completely different. A giant staircase of 6 shrinking tiers, not the smooth four-sided shape everyone knows from postcards. Between that early stepped form and the classic smooth pyramid came a whole era of experimentation, including the famous bent pyramid of Pharaoh Sneferu, father of the legendary Khufu, where the angle of the sides abruptly changes about halfway up. Most Egyptologists attribute this to an engineering mistake corrected in time to stop the structure collapsing under its own weight. Sneferu, it turns out, was an especially persistent builder. On top of this failed attempt, he's credited with as many as 3 or 4 pyramids total, making him the ruler who built more pyramids than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history, though, ironically, far less famous than his own son. Beyond the major royal pyramids, there are also dozens of much smaller satellite pyramids built next to the main monuments for queens and other royal family members. And some pyramids from later, poorer periods of Egyptian history weren't even built from solid stone, but from mud brick, which is why they survive in much worse condition today, looking more like slumped mounds than recognizable geometric shapes. Before moving on, one observation worth keeping in mind, since it'll keep resurfacing throughout today's video. Egypt is a rare country whose fame has gotten so tightly compressed around one narrow historical period and one recognizable image that it's practically eclipsed the rest of its nearly 5,000-year continuous history. The pyramids, for all their well-earned fame, are just the tip of the iceberg. And already, just 6 myths in, the gap between legend and reality feels pretty clear. Let's wrap up the monuments themselves and move to something just as fascinating. What was actually inside these tombs and the ancient Egyptian religion built around death and the afterlife? Myth number 7. Every Egyptian mummy was embalmed the same standardized, elaborate way. Organs removed, treated with special oils, wrapped in endless layers of linen bandages, exactly the way horror movies show it. The reality of mummification turns out to be far more socially stratified and varied than commonly assumed. The full, expensive ritual described by Herodotus, pulling the brain out through the nostril with a special hook, removing and separately embalming the organs in canopic jars, dehydrating the body in natron salt for 40 days, then wrapping it in hundreds of meters of fine linen, sometimes totaling several kilometers, was available exclusively to pharaohs, top priests, and very wealthy officials. The process alone could cost the equivalent of a middle-class family's annual income, and handling the body was considered so ritually unclean that the specialists who physically opened it to remove the organs occupied one of the lowest, most looked-down-on rungs in the embalmer's hierarchy, while the priests overseeing the ritual and reciting sacred formulas held far higher status, despite barely touching the body themselves. Less wealthy Egyptians had far simpler, far cheaper options, down to simply dehydrating the body in hot desert sand with no organ removal at all, a method that, ironically, is exactly how the very first ancient Egyptians ended up accidentally mummified, before formal rituals were even invented, purely through natural desert conditions. The full embalming process, per Herodotus, took exactly 70 days, 40 of which went to dehydration alone, with the rest devoted to ritual wrapping, while priest embalmers recited special incantations and wore masks of Anubis, the god of mummification, personally overseeing every stage. The heart, unlike the other organs, was deliberately left inside the body, since Egyptians considered it, not the brain, the seat of memory and the soul, needed for the later weighing ceremony at the judgment of Osiris in the afterlife. Myth number 8. Every pyramid necessarily contains the pharaoh's mummy, the whole reason the monument was built. In reality, the vast majority of pyramids discovered to date, including the Great Pyramid of Khufu itself, have been found completely empty inside. No mummy, no treasure, no burial goods. One of the biggest disappointments and mysteries for archaeologists across centuries of research, despite the popular assumption every tomb must be bursting with gold like in an adventure movie. One rare exception was Pharaoh Sekhemkhet's pyramid, discovered only in the mid-20th century. Archaeologists excitedly opened an untouched sarcophagus, only to find it completely empty, with not a single mummy, sparking debate over whether the pharaoh was buried elsewhere entirely, or, an explanation many modern researchers find more likely, whether his short, abruptly ended reign meant the tomb simply never got finished. Some researchers believe tombs were looted by robbers in antiquity despite protective traps. Others point out that after mass pyramid robberies, later pharaohs deliberately switched to hidden, disguised underground tombs in the remote Valley of the Kings, far harder to find than a giant stone pyramid visible for miles. That's exactly why Tutankhamun's famous, nearly intact tomb, found in the Valley of the Kings rather than a pyramid, caused such a worldwide sensation. One of the very few times in the history of Egyptology a pharaoh's burial was found practically unlooted.
Even Tutankhamun's tomb shows signs of at least 2 small robberies shortly after burial, based on evidence of hasty resealing. Though thieves were apparently caught mid-act and only made off with a small fraction of the jewelry before the tomb was resealed and buried under construction debris from a later tomb, which, ironically, is exactly what protected it from looters for 3,000 years.
Myth number 9. The ancient Egyptians literally worshipped ordinary house cats as living gods, bowing before any random street cat. In reality, Egyptians' relationship with cats was far more interesting than direct worship. Cats really did hold a special honored status as protectors of grain stores from rodents and snakes, and killing one, even accidentally, was punished extremely harshly, up to execution, according to ancient authors. There was a goddess, Bastet, usually depicted as a woman with a cat's head, or, in earlier periods, a much fiercer lioness's head, symbolizing home protection, fertility, and motherhood. And it was her, not ordinary animals, who was worshipped as a deity. Regular cats were sacred animals dedicated to her, not gods themselves, much the way certain animals are considered sacred messengers rather than deities in other religions. Bastet's annual festival in her home city of Bubastis, per Herodotus, drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims arriving by boat along the Nile, and involved, in his words, mass celebration, music, and wine consumption far beyond the rest of the year, making it, in the ancient historian's own view, one of the most crowded and joyful religious events in all of Egypt. Archaeologists have found entire huge cemeteries of mummified cats brought by pilgrims as votive offerings to Bastet at her main temple center, pointing to a whole developed industry breeding cats specifically for ritual offerings, rather than a literal cult of every individual animal. The historian Diodorus Siculus described an incident where a Roman envoy accidentally killed a cat and was torn apart by an enraged Egyptian mob, despite the Egyptian king's own attempt to protect him for the sake of relations with Rome. That's how strong ordinary people's religious feelings toward sacred animals ran, even against their own rulers' political interests. Myth number 10. Egyptian hieroglyphs remained a totally undeciphered mystery until the chance discovery of the Rosetta Stone in the late 18th century, after which scholars instantly cracked the writing basically overnight. The real decipherment story is much longer and more dramatic. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon's soldiers in 1799 but seized as a trophy by the victorious British and held in the British Museum ever since, still a source of official Egyptian repatriation demands today, really was the key, but only the starting point of a process stretching over 2 decades of intense scholarly work by several generations of researchers across Europe. Final decipherment of the hieroglyphic system came only in 1822 from French linguist Jean-François Champollion, who spent years comparing the stone's parallel Greek and Demotic texts against the hieroglyphic portion, with the decisive breakthrough being his realization that hieroglyphs weren't a purely symbolic pictographic system, as earlier researchers had wrongly assumed for centuries, but a mixed system including phonetic signs capable of representing actual speech sounds, almost like letters in our own alphabet. Legend has it Champollion was so overwhelmed by his own discovery, at the moment he confirmed he'd correctly read a cartouche bearing Pharaoh Ramses' name, that he fainted from the excitement and couldn't recover for days. Worth noting, too, hieroglyphic writing existed alongside 2 other more cursive forms of the same language, hieratic and demotic, used for everyday business records, while ceremonial hieroglyphs carved in stone remained primarily a monumental form of writing, which is partly why the Rosetta Stone's decree text was duplicated across 3 separate writing systems at once. Myth number 11. Ancient Egyptian religion and culture stayed completely unchanged and frozen for the entire 3,000 years the pharaonic civilization existed, as if time moved differently there than in the rest of the world. In reality, 3,000 years is a colossal historical span, over which Egyptian religion, art, and society went through numerous transformations comparable in scale to the entire journey European civilization has made from antiquity to today. The clearest example of religious revolution is the reign of heretic pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE,
who tried to radically restructure Egypt's traditional polytheistic pantheon, numbering dozens of worshipped deities with their own temples and colossal landholdings, introducing an almost monotheistic cult of the single sun disk Aten, shutting the traditional temples and moving the capital to a brand new city built from scratch in the desert. Akhet Aten, Horizon of Aten, of which only foundations remain today, since it was abandoned and deliberately destroyed right after his death by successors eager to erase the memory of a failed religious experiment. This reform proved so radical and unpopular with the conservative priesthood that it was fully reversed immediately after Akhenaten's death by his successors, including, notably, the young Tutankhamun himself, whose own name originally meant living image of Aten, before being changed to the familiar living image of Amun, specifically as part of undoing his father's reform. Akhenaten's wife, the legendary Queen Nefertiti, whose famous sculpted bust, with its perfectly symmetrical features, now sits in a Berlin museum and remains one of the most recognizable works of art from all of antiquity, may, according to some modern research, have personally ruled Egypt alone for a time after her husband's death, under her own throne name. Though this hypothesis remains actively debated, given how sparse the surviving sources are for this turbulent transitional period.
Myth number 12, closing out the block on mummies and religion. The young pharaoh Tutankhamun was one of Egypt's greatest, most powerful rulers, whose fame during his lifetime spread across the ancient world. The paradoxical irony here is that during his actual lifetime, Tutankhamun was, in fact, a minor, second-tier ruler. He took the throne as a child, around age 9. Real power apparently rested with his regents and advisors, and he died young himself, around 19, without accomplishing anything particularly notable in terms of military victories or major building projects, the usual measures of a pharaoh's greatness. The only notable achievement of his short reign was formally reversing his father's religious reform and restoring the traditional temples, more a return to the old order than an accomplishment of his own. His worldwide fame came entirely after death, and purely by chance, thanks to the single fact that his comparatively modest tomb happened to get partially buried under stone chips from the construction of another, later tomb built right above it, which, by a miracle, kept it from being looted for more than 3,000 years, until it was found almost fully intact in 1922, while the tombs of far more significant pharaohs like Ramses II, who ruled almost 70 years and left behind a colossal number of monuments across Egypt, were looted long ago in antiquity. There's a fitting counterpoint in this find's modern commercial fate. Tutankhamun's famous golden death mask, gracing the covers of countless books and souvenirs today, weighs over 10 kilograms of pure gold and was, according to some research, likely not made specifically for him at all, but originally intended for another, more prominent royal family member, then hastily adapted for his own unexpectedly sudden funeral. One more piece of indirect evidence for just how minor and unprepared for his own burial was by the standards of the era. Worth noting a detail that often escapes attention outside the narrow circle of Egyptologists. Almost everything we know about the daily life and beliefs of ancient Egyptians has come down to us not by accident, but thanks to their own obsession with recording the world around them in text and image. From legal contracts and medical prescriptions to personal letters and school children's exercises copying out moralizing texts, making this one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations of the ancient world, contrary to the popular image of silent, mysterious monuments hoarding secrets.
Archaeologists have found school tablets with a teacher's corrections and whiny notes from slacking students explaining away their own tardiness. Remarkably relatable, even thousands of years later. We're already a third of the way through, having covered mummies and pharaonic religion. A good moment to pause and ask a question worth holding on to. If reality already diverges this much from legend, what happens once we get to the modern era, the Suez Crisis and the Arab Spring? Stick around. For now, let's move from deep antiquity to the present and see how much of the typical Egypt image actually matches the country's life today. Myth number 13. Ordinary modern Egyptians still get around the country daily by camel, just like their distant ancestors thousands of years ago. Camels genuinely exist in modern Egypt and remain part of the cultural landscape, but strictly in a narrow tourism niche. Camel rides by the pyramids or desert safaris for foreign visitors have long since become their own small business, aimed at travelers wanting a photo with the ancient monuments in some exotic flair. To be fair, there's a kernel of truth in this myth for some remote desert communities and Bedouin tribes of the Sinai and Western Desert, where the camel remains, to this day, a genuinely practical way to get around terrain ordinary wheeled vehicles can't handle. But real modern Egypt, in its densely populated heartland, is one of the most urbanized countries in the Middle East, where the vast majority of the country's more than 100 million residents use perfectly ordinary 21st century transportation. Cars, buses, an extensive taxi network, and Cairo boasts its own metro system, the first, and for a long time the only, full subway in all of Africa and the Middle East, launched back in 1987 and carrying millions of passengers daily, which comes as a genuine surprise to most foreigners who picture Egypt purely through desert and camels. Cairo traffic, which more realistically reflects everyday life, is known for its famously chaotic jams rather than leisurely camel caravans, and Cairenes have long joked their city's road markings play a decorative rather than practical role. That said, the camel market in the suburb of Burkash does remain active today, just not for tourists, but for the wholesale trading of livestock brought in mostly from Sudan. Myth number 14. All of Egypt is one lifeless, endless desert without a single patch of green wherever you look. This is almost technically true, in the sense that about 95% of the country's land really is officially classified as desert. But that statistic creates a completely wrong impression of the real density of human life, because practically the entire population, over 95% of residents, is packed into a narrow, incredibly fertile strip along the Nile's course and delta, making up only about 4% of total land area. This narrow green ribbon, visible even from space against the surrounding brown desert, is one of the most densely farmed agricultural areas on the planet, growing cotton, rice, wheat, sugarcane, and countless other crops for millennia. Some especially fertile stretches once yielded up to 3 harvests a year thanks to the Nile's annual natural floods, which stopped after the Aswan Dam was built, something we'll get to separately later. From space, the boundary between Green Valley and Brown Desert looks so sharp it seems drawn with a ruler. In satellite images, all of Egypt resembles a thin green stem with a fanned-out delta at the end, while the rest of the country's area is essentially near empty space, apart from scattered oases and the Red Sea resort towns. Myth number 15. Egyptian cuisine is essentially the same as any other Middle Eastern or Arab cuisine, with no distinct identity of its own, just another version of hummus and shawarma. In reality, Egypt has a whole set of unique national dishes that are absent from or significantly different than the food of neighboring Arab countries. Egypt's #1 national dish, eaten almost daily across every social class, is kosheri, a hearty mix of rice, lentils, macaroni, chickpeas, and fried onion, doused in spicy tomato sauce. A dish that's itself a culinary mashup shaped by Italian,
Indian, and Middle Eastern cuisines through the history of British colonial presence. The macaroni and tomato sauce came from Italian traders and workers who settled in 19th century Egypt, and the technique of cooking rice with lentils echoes the Indian dish khichdi, unsurprising given the intense trade and colonial ties of an empire that included both India and Egypt at once. Today, Cairo has entire chains of eateries specializing purely in koshery, prepared and served in minutes on an industrial scale, with a portion cheap enough that koshery is fairly called a genuine national dish, bringing together every social class at the same, not exactly fancy, but deeply beloved table. Another genuinely Egyptian dish is foul medames, stewed fava beans with spices traditionally served for breakfast, seasoned with olive oil, lemon juice, and cumin, traceable archaeologically all the way back to the pharaohs. Recipes strikingly similar to modern foul appear in texts dating to the New Kingdom, making it, in effect, a living culinary monument that Egyptians have eaten for breakfast for more than 3,000 years with essentially no change to the core recipe. Molokhia, a thick, bright green soup made from the chopped leaves of a mallow family plant, traditionally cooked in chicken or rabbit broth with garlic and coriander, is another dish closely associated specifically with Egyptian rather than broader Arab identity, though similar dishes based on the same plant do show up in a few neighboring Eastern Mediterranean countries, which regularly sparks good-natured culinary arguments over whose version came first. Worth a mention, too, Habib el-Nil, dates of the Nile, sweets made only for certain religious holidays, and salab, a hot, sweet drink from orchid root starch, traditionally served in winter and sprinkled with cinnamon and nuts, a detail that usually completely escapes foreigners who picture Egyptian cuisine purely through hummus and falafel, dishes Egyptians themselves, incidentally, consider more Palestinian and Levantine imports than originally their own. Myth number 16. All Egyptians speak the exact same standard Arabic, identical to what's spoken, say, in Saudi Arabia or Morocco. The reality of the Arabic-speaking world is far more complex. There's modern standard Arabic, a formal written norm used in official documents and news across the Arab world and understood by educated speakers practically everywhere. But in everyday spoken life, every Arab country, and even individual regions within one, speaks its own, often significantly different dialect. Different enough that speakers of the most distant dialects, say Moroccan and Iraqi, sometimes prefer switching to the literary standard, or even English, to understand each other without trouble. In this whole linguistic mosaic, the Egyptian dialect occupies a special position as a kind of neutral bridge, understood by nearly everyone. Thanks to the colossal historical influence of Egyptian cinema, which took off as early as the 1930s, and television, which turned Cairo into the genuine cultural capital of the entire Arab world in the 20th century. It wasn't for nothing that Cairo was called the Hollywood of the Middle East for decades.
The Egyptian dialect remains, paradoxically, the most widely understood spoken dialect across the whole Arabic-speaking region. Egyptian films, music, and soap operas were watched and listened to across the Middle East for decades, from Marrakesh to Baghdad. And thanks to that, even people from far-off Arab countries who've never set foot in Egypt are often able to understand spoken Egyptian better than Egyptians, without preparation, can understand, say, Moroccan Arabic, which can sound to many other Arabs like a completely separate language.
The Egyptian dialect itself absorbed a notable amount of vocabulary directly from Coptic, the descendant of ancient Egyptian, as well as from Turkish, a legacy of the long Ottoman rule. Even basic grammar differs noticeably from the classical standard. Negation, for instance, works differently, with the typical Egyptian spoken construction sandwiching the verb between special particles on both sides, a detail easy to miss for an outside ear, but one that instantly gives away an Egyptian speaker to any native Arabic listener. Thanks to decades of cultural dominance from Egyptian film and music, this same dialect has also become a kind of unofficial lingua franca of Arab pop culture as a whole. Myth number 17. Egypt is a completely religiously uniform Muslim country with no meaningful religious diversity whatsoever. In reality, Egypt is home to one of the oldest and largest Christian communities anywhere in the Middle East, the Coptic Church, whose roots trace directly to early Christianity in the 1st century CE, long before Islam arrived in the region in the 7th century. Copts, making up by various estimates 6 to 10% of Egypt's population, an exact figure that remains disputed since the official census long avoided a direct religion question, are one of the most numerous Christian minorities in the entire Muslim world and have preserved their own ancient liturgical tradition and alphabet, descended directly from ancient Egyptian script by way of Greek, making Coptic, though it fell out of everyday spoken use by around the 17th century, a living linguistic bridge connecting the present directly to the language of the pharaohs. It's largely thanks to Coptic, written in the Greek alphabet with a few extra characters and preserving live pronunciation of ancient Egyptian sounds, that 19th century scholars were able to reconstruct roughly how words sounded that hieroglyphs themselves mostly rendered as consonants without vowels. Without this surviving church tradition, modern reconstruction of the pharaoh's language would be far more speculative. Coptic Christians have gone through periods of both relatively peaceful coexistence and tension with the Muslim majority throughout history, and this religious diversity remains an important, if not always widely known outside Egypt, part of the country's national identity. The Coptic calendar, still used by the Church to calculate religious holidays, traces directly back to the ancient Egyptian solar calendar, not the later Islamic lunar one, making it one more living thread stretching across millennia, straight from the pharaohs into today's religious practice. Cairo's largest Coptic cathedral, St. Mark's, draws thousands of pilgrims every year for Christmas, which Copts, following the old Julian calendar, celebrate on January 7th rather than December 25th. Myth number 18. Closing the block on modern everyday life. Modern Egyptians are basically a completely different people with no direct blood or cultural connection to the ancient pyramid builders, since the country has been repeatedly conquered and resettled by different peoples over the millennia. This actually remains a subject of serious scientific debate, but modern genetic studies of ancient Egyptian mummies, published in recent years in prestigious journals and based on DNA from dozens of mummies across different historical periods,
show a surprisingly high degree of genetic continuity between the Pharaonic-era Nile Valley population and modern Egyptians, especially outside major port cities like Alexandria, historically more prone to mixing with incoming populations since antiquity due to maritime trade. Yes, Egypt certainly went through waves of Persian, Greek, Roman, and Arab conquest and settlement, leaving real cultural, linguistic, and, to some degree, genetic marks. But the idea of complete population replacement is an oversimplification not backed by modern science, and often rooted in outdated 19th century racial theories that, for ideological reasons, sought to separate ancient Egyptian achievement from the region's modern, mostly Arabic-speaking population. Most Egyptologists and geneticists now agree that the modern Nile Valley population is a largely continuous biological and cultural descendant of the ancient Egyptians, considerably enriched by later influences rather than the result of full ethnic replacement. Tellingly, even folk traditions among rural fellahin farmers in the Nile Valley, even from agricultural rituals tied to the seasonal flood cycle to certain superstitions, often find direct parallels in texts and images surviving from the pharaonic era, something many folklorists and anthropologists see as one more piece of indirect evidence of cultural continuity rather than a complete break. A similar continuity shows up in folk medicine, too. Some traditional remedies still used in remote rural Nile Valley areas, including certain medicinal plants and honey-based preparations, find direct parallels in pharaonic-era medical papyri, like the famous Ebers papyrus, dating to around 1500 BCE and containing hundreds of remedies, one of the oldest surviving medical treatises in human history, still studied today.
The annual Sham el-Nessim holiday, celebrated the Monday after Orthodox Easter, and to this day celebrated with equal enthusiasm by both Muslims and Christians in Egypt, traces, per most historians, directly to an ancient Egyptian spring festival recorded on monuments thousands of years before either religion existed. A rare example of a nationwide ritual uniting modern Egyptians across religious lines precisely because of its pre-religious pharaonic origin. Worth mentioning, despite Arabic's formal status as the sole official language, fluency in English or French as a second language is extremely widespread in Egypt's big cities, especially among educated youth, rooted in the colonial and early post-colonial era, when attending a private European-style school marked belonging to the educated urban class, a tradition still largely visible in the country's private education system today. Having covered modern everyday life, it's worth pausing on the theme that invisibly connects everything from the ancient pharaohs to today's fellahin farmers. The phenomenon of the gift of the Nile, as Herodotus called Egypt 2,500 years ago, aptly noting that this country's whole civilization is, at its core, the product of one single river, without which this would simply be lifeless desert. Let's turn to the river you can't imagine Egypt without, the Nile, the country's geography, and its economy. Myth number 19. The Nile, like most of the world's major rivers, flows from north to south toward the equator, since Egypt is in Africa, and it seems logical to expect the river to head toward the tropics. This intuitive conclusion turns out to be completely wrong, and regularly stumps even educated people hearing the truth for the first time. The Nile actually flows the opposite way from what you'd expect, south to north, from sources in equatorial Africa, particularly the Great Lakes region, through Uganda and Sudan, and finally Egypt, emptying into the Mediterranean in the north. The river's total length, by various estimates, runs 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers, making it one of the two longest rivers on the planet, alongside South America's Amazon, with the debate over which is actually longer still scientifically unsettled due to the difficulty of pinning down each river's true source. That's exactly why, on ancient Egyptian maps, south was traditionally considered up and north down, sounding completely backward to modern people used to maps with north on top, even though that modern convention is itself just a historical accident, not an objective law of nature. Hence the not quite intuitive names, Upper Egypt for the southern, upstream part of the country, and Lower Egypt for the northern part and delta. This confusion over the direction of flow has more than once caused genuinely amusing historical misunderstandings. When Alexander the Great's troops first encountered the Nile, some Greek soldiers, used to rivers flowing from mountains to sea in the direction they knew, were so thrown off that ancient authors seriously debated dozens of fantastical theories about the river's source, including the idea that the Nile was somehow connected to the distant Indian Ganges. Myth number 20. Egypt belongs entirely and unambiguously to the African continent culturally, with no significant connection to the Arab and Middle Eastern world. Or, in the opposite version, is a purely Arab and Middle Eastern country in spirit with practically no ties to the rest of Africa. Reality reflects a genuinely dual geographic and cultural position. Egypt is geographically located on the African continent, a member of the African Union, and nobody disputes that continental history. But the Sinai Peninsula, roughly 60,000 square kilometers, sits geographically already in Asia, making Egypt one of the few genuinely transcontinental countries in the world, physically spanning two continents alongside states like Russia or Turkey, though with a much smaller Asian share than those two examples. Sinai remains a strategically important demilitarized zone under the peace treaty with Israel, which we'll get to later. Cairo's Al-Azhar University, founded in the 10th century, remains one of the oldest continuously operating institutions of higher learning on the planet, and one of the most authoritative religious centers of Sunni Islam worldwide. Culturally and linguistically, over nearly 14 centuries since the 7th century Arab conquest. The country has been deeply integrated into the Arab and Islamic world as a founding member of the Arab League, established back in 1945 in Cairo, which served as its de facto headquarters for decades, all while preserving the deepest historical and archaeological ties to its pre-Islamic, pre-Arab pharaonic heritage, which Africa itself rightly considers part of its own continental legacy. Egypt, in effect, is a rare example of a country organically combining African, Arab, and Mediterranean identities all at once, rather than belonging strictly to just one. Myth number 21. Egypt's enormous population is spread evenly across the country's vast territory, the way it is in most other large countries. We already touched on this regarding the desert, but the demographic angle is worth its own look because the numbers are genuinely staggering. With a total land area comparable to France and Spain combined, the actually inhabited part of Egypt is limited to that narrow strip along the Nile and its delta, meaning more than 100 million people are literally squeezed into an area comparable to Belgium or the Netherlands alone. That makes the Nile Valley one of the most densely inhabited areas on the planet. Parts of Old Cairo show population densities comparable to the most overcrowded slum neighborhoods in the world, tens of thousands of people per square kilometer, sometimes living in buildings originally built in medieval times and never designed for this kind of load. Cairo, the largest city in the Arab world and Africa, has to grapple daily with a colossal strain on infrastructure never designed for this scale. The country's authorities have even begun building an entirely new administrative capital in the desert near Cairo, specifically meant to relocate part of the government and relieve the overcrowded historic center. Myth number 22. Modern Egypt's economy runs almost entirely on tourism revenue from foreign visitors to the pyramids and other ancient monuments. Tourism really is a significant, visible source of income, bringing in billions of dollars annually and employing millions of people, from guides and hotel owners to souvenir sellers and tour bus drivers. But reducing the entire economic life of a 100 million person country to this one sector badly oversimplifies things. What's more, back in the 1960s under Nasser, the country actively built its own heavy industry, and the Helwan steel complex outside Cairo, built with Soviet support, was long the largest iron and steel plant on the entire African continent. Beyond the pyramids, a significant share of the country's tourism revenue comes from Red Sea resort zones like Hurghada and Sharm el-Sheikh, specializing for decades in beach and diving tourism, drawing millions of vacationers, many of whom, surprisingly, never visit a single pyramid during their whole trip, preferring coral reefs to historical monuments, something Egyptian tour operators long ago recognized as its own distinct market segment, barely overlapping the classic pyramid tourism crowd. Today, Egypt has a fairly diversified economy by Middle Eastern standards, including major textile and food processing industries, substantial agriculture based on the fertile Nile Valley, making the country a top world producer of cotton, citrus, and dates, natural gas extraction on the Mediterranean shelf, including the massive Zohr field, discovered by an Italian company in 2015, and one of the largest Mediterranean gas discoveries in decades, turning Egypt from an energy importer into a net exporter, and colossal Suez Canal revenue, through which a huge share of world maritime trade passes, bringing many billions of dollars in transit fees annually, often comparable to or exceeding tourism, especially during global disruptions like the pandemic, which gutted tourist numbers but didn't stop cargo ships moving through the canal. Worth mentioning, too, significant residential construction, especially on the outskirts of major cities, consists of so-called informal districts, built without official permits and connected to infrastructure only after the fact, home today to a large share of the country's urban population. Also worth a note, a comparatively new but notable income source is film and television production, including international co-productions using real Egyptian landscapes and historical settings, bringing both direct filming revenue and free tourism advertising. The contribution of Egypt's large diaspora spread across the Gulf, North America, and Europe for decades. A young but rapidly growing IT and outsourcing industry serving European and Middle Eastern clients. And money sent home by millions of Egyptians working abroad, mainly in the wealthy Gulf oil states, an income stream that in some years has exceeded tourism and Suez Canal revenue combined. Myth number 23. The Suez Canal has always, from its very opening, unconditionally and fully belonged to Egypt as a natural extension of national sovereignty. The canal's real history, ceremonially opened in 1869 before a crowd of European royals and dignitaries, is far more complicated. It was built to the design of French diplomat and engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps with heavy French financial and technical involvement, and the company created to operate it spent decades under mostly foreign, Franco-British control. Not the kind of full Egyptian sovereign management we assume for national infrastructure today. That changed fundamentally only in 1956 when President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the canal's nationalization, handing full control to the Egyptian state, a decision that triggered the Suez Crisis, a joint military intervention by Britain, France, and Israel that ultimately had to retreat, humiliated, under enormous diplomatic and financial pressure both from the United States, which refused to prop up the British pound at the critical moment, and from the Soviet Union, which openly threatened military intervention. Despite some military losses on the ground, this became a symbolic triumph of national sovereignty for Nasser and Egypt, and one of the key events of the 20th century, marking the final decline of European colonial influence in the Middle East. The canal underwent a massive modernization in 2015, with a parallel channel dug alongside the historic route, allowing two-way traffic. And in 2021, World News spent nearly a week fixated on the giant container ship Ever Given, which ran aground sideways during a sudden sandstorm and completely blocked the canal for days, vividly showing how fragile global logistics tied to one narrow waterway can be. Myth number 24. Closing the block on geography and economy. The Aswan High Dam was an unqualified triumph for Egypt with no serious downsides. The dam, built with massive Soviet technical and financial help after Western powers refused funding in response to Nasser's turn toward the socialist bloc, itself a direct cause of the Suez Canal nationalization, and completed in 1970, did bring colossal, undeniable benefits. It permanently controlled the Nile's catastrophic, unpredictable flooding, which, for centuries, had alternately destroyed harvests and left fields dry in drought years, and provided a huge supply of cheap hydroelectric power that fueled Egypt's industrialization and still supplies a significant share of the country's electricity today. But this massive project also came with serious, often underappreciated, environmental costs. Ending the natural annual floods deprived farmers' fields of the free silt that had fertilized the Nile Valley for millennia, forcing a costly switch to imported chemical fertilizer. Far less sediment reached the Delta and Mediterranean, causing gradual coastal erosion and a noticeable decline in commercial fish population, and creating the massive reservoir known as Lake Nasser, forced the relocation of tens of thousands of indigenous Nubian people whose ancestral villages had stood along this stretch of the Nile for millennia and now lie permanently underwater. Still a painful chapter in Nubian collective memory. It also threatened to fully submerge the priceless rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel, built under Ramesses II, which had to be urgently cut into blocks and physically relocated to higher ground through a massive international rescue operation under UNESCO. This unprecedented project largely laid the groundwork for the modern concept of World Cultural Heritage and led directly to the creation of today's UNESCO World Heritage List, to which the Abu Simbel temples and the nearby Philae complex were among the very first sites added anywhere in the world. Worth mentioning, too, in 2015, Egypt announced construction of a new administrative capital in the desert east of Cairo, an ambitious city built from scratch, which many observers compared to ancient royal relocation projects like Akhenaten's, just with 21st century tools. Also worth noting, Beyond the narrow Nile Valley, Egypt has several fertile oases scattered across the western desert: Siwa, Bahariya, Farafra, Dala, and Karga, each existing for millennia as a relatively isolated world with its own local traditions, dialects, and sometimes distinct ethnic groups, like the Siwi Berbers, who speak a language completely unrelated to Arabic. Now let's look at the part of Egyptian history that stays unfairly overshadowed by the pharaohs, despite spanning a far longer stretch than the pyramid era itself. The more than 2,000 years most people compress into one phrase: and then the Arabs came.
Myth number 25. Throughout its multi-thousand-year history, Egypt remained a fully independent sovereign state governed exclusively by its own native rulers, with no lasting periods of foreign rule. In reality, Egyptian history after the classical pharaonic era is an almost unbroken chain of conquest by foreign powers stretching over 2,000 years. Persians under the Achaemenid Empire conquered the country twice. Then, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great took it, welcomed by locals exhausted by harsh Persian rule as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He even made a special pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at the remote Siwa oasis to secure local religious legitimacy. After him, the Greco-Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty ruled for almost 3 centuries, to which, incidentally, the famous Cleopatra belonged. Yes, the queen mass culture firmly associates with authentic ancient Egypt was ethnically Greek by origin, not a native Egyptian, and, per contemporaries, was practically the only member of her dynasty who bothered learning the local language. Cleopatra reportedly spoke several languages beyond her native Greek, including Egyptian and Ethiopian, and by some accounts up to 9 total, making her an outstanding diplomat capable of negotiating with foreign envoys without a translator, a rare skill for rulers of her dynasty, which, for nearly 3 centuries, had deliberately kept itself apart from the native population. After Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony's joint suicide following defeat by the future Roman Emperor Augustus, the country became a Roman, then Byzantine province for several centuries, before being conquered by Arab Muslim forces under commander Amr ibn al-As in the 7th century, just years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. It was subsequently ruled by various Islamic dynasties and military castes, including the famous Mamluks, warrior slaves mostly of Turkic and Caucasus origin who paradoxically seized supreme power and ruled Egypt for almost 3 centuries, while formally remaining enslaved people by legal status. It then spent several centuries as part of the Ottoman Empire, before falling under intense British colonial influence and direct military occupation starting in 1882, under the pretext of suppressing a nationalist uprising and protecting European creditors' financial interests. A genuinely, fully independent, sovereign, modern-style nation-state only emerged relatively recently, in the 20th century. And even formal independence in 1922 remained half measures for a long time, since Britain kept control of defense, foreign affairs, and, especially sensitively, the Suez Canal. There's a telling linguistic trace of foreign rule here too. The word pharaoh itself doesn't come directly from Egyptian, but is a Greek adaptation of the Egyptian phrase per'ah, literally great house, originally referring not to the ruler but to the royal palace as an institution, only later applied to the monarch himself. Myth number 26. The famous Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's largest book collection, was completely and instantly destroyed in one dramatic fire set by Julius Caesar's soldiers during his Egyptian campaign. The library's real fate is a far more complicated, drawn-out story of gradual, centuries-long decline, not one catastrophe. The fire, genuinely set by accident during Caesar's 48 BCE Alexandrian campaign, certainly did damage, likely destroying scrolls stored in the city's port warehouses. But most modern historians agree the library's main collection, housed separately at the Royal Palace complex rather than the port, likely survived this specific incident largely intact.
The institution's further fate involves gradual decline in funding and scholarly status over subsequent centuries of Roman rule, plus a series of smaller, repeated losses during internal conflicts and religious persecution. Some scholars believe a serious blow came from a Roman imperial decree against pagan cults at the end of the 4th century CE, which reportedly led to destroying the associated Serapeum temple, where part of the collection was
likely kept. Chronologically, the library's decline sits closer to the notorious 415 CE murder of philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria by a religiously motivated mob, often symbolically, if not entirely accurately, associated with the end of ancient science in the city. The myth of one dramatic Caesar-caused fire is a convenient but historically inaccurate simplification of a centuries-long process, and, by some accounts, part of Alexandria's accumulated knowledge survived through manuscript copying at other Mediterranean centers well before the institution's final decline. So, the library's loss, tragic as it was, wasn't the instant vanishing of all ancient knowledge popular culture sometimes portrays. Myth number 27. The 7th century Arab Islamic conquest completely destroyed all ancient Egyptian pharaonic cultural and physical heritage, leaving a scorched cultural wasteland. In fact, the vast majority of Egypt's ancient monuments, including the pyramids themselves, the Sphinx, and numerous temple complexes, survived the comparatively fast and, by historical standards, peaceful Arab conquest, largely undamaged, remaining in relatively good condition through the following Islamic centuries, and drawing genuine curiosity from medieval Arab travelers and scholars who left plenty of written descriptions of these monuments. What's more, a significant share of our modern scientific knowledge of ancient Egypt actually comes from the work of medieval Arab historians and geographers who carefully documented the state of ancient monuments, sometimes with more precision than their European contemporaries of the same period. Some physical damage to individual monuments really did happen over the centuries, but it was more often tied to prosaic economic motives than religious campaigns. The pyramids' famous polished white limestone casing, which once gave them a smooth, gleaming look, was indeed gradually stripped by locals in the Middle Ages, but not out of religious hatred for a pagan past, rather for the practical purpose of building mosques and homes for growing medieval Cairo, for which finished cut stone was cheap, convenient material. Many medieval Cairo mosques and citadels are literally built from repurposed stone taken from older monuments, a practice modern archaeology sees not as hostility to the past, but as ordinary pre-modern resource recycling, no different from medieval Europeans dismantling Roman buildings for cathedral stone. Myth number 28. Napoleon Bonaparte's late 18th century Egyptian campaign was purely a military territorial conquest, with no broader cultural or scientific dimension. In fact, Napoleon's Egyptian expedition is remembered specifically because he brought along a large group of scientists, engineers, artists, and researchers, almost 150 specialists across various fields, to systematically document, for the first time in modern history, Egypt's ancient monuments, flora, fauna, and daily life, with scientific precision earlier European travelers had never achieved. These specialists included chemists, botanists, engineers, and even musicologists, transcribing local melodies, making Napoleon's expedition, in effect, history's first truly interdisciplinary scientific mission of this scale organized under wartime conditions. This scientific expedition, working alongside the military campaign, sometimes literally under enemy fire, discovered the Rosetta Stone and later produced the massive multi-volume Description de l'Égypte, a foundational document that literally launched the entire modern discipline of Egyptology, sparking a European craze known as Egyptomania, with Egyptian motifs showing up in architecture, jewelry, and clothing, echoes still visible on some European building facades today from the turn of the 20th century. The military campaign itself ended rather ingloriously. The French fleet was almost entirely destroyed by British Admiral Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, and Napoleon, abandoning his army, secretly returned to France,
where he soon seized power. One of the more curious scientific results of this expedition involved precise astronomical images discovered on the ceiling of the temple at Dendera, which later sparked fierce disputes between French scholars and church authorities over the true age of Egyptian civilization, since the star map seemed to point to a date far more ancient than the biblical chronology accepted in Europe at the time. Myth number 29. The ruler called the founder of modern Egypt was named Muhammad Ali, and the name, coincidence with the famous American boxer, is nothing more than a funny footnote unworthy of real attention. In fact, Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Ottoman military commander of Albanian origin who seized power in Egypt in the early 19th century amid the chaos after Napoleon's army withdrew, deserves far more attention on his own merits. This energetic, ambitious ruler, while formerly just a vassal of the distant Ottoman Sultan, effectively built a fully independent, hereditary ruling dynasty that continuously governed Egypt right up to the 1952 revolution. He carried out massive European-style modernization, reforming the army, building a modern education system, laying the foundations of factory industry, and initiated large-scale cultivation of long fiber cotton, turning Egypt into a key global supplier for Europe's growing textile industry, with demand spiking especially during the American Civil War, when a blockade of southern ports cut off American cotton and gave Egyptian producers a rare chance to fill the gap. The colossal international debts accumulated by Muhammad Ali's successors to fund ambitious modernization projects, including the Suez Canal, ultimately led to a declared state bankruptcy and the creation of a special international commission over Egyptian finances, opening the door to subsequent British financial and political interference. The dynasty he founded formally lasted until 1952, and its last representative, King Farouk, known for his extravagant taste for luxury, was overthrown by a group of military officers who proclaimed Egypt a republic, ending nearly a century and a half of rule by this originally Ottoman family. Myth number 30. Closing the historical block. The name Egypt, used by the rest of the world, is the same word Egyptians themselves have always called their own country. In reality, our familiar word Egypt is an adaptation of the ancient Greek name Aegyptos, which, per one leading linguistic theory, itself traces back to a garbled ancient Egyptian name for a temple complex in Memphis, later extended by the Greeks to the whole country. Egyptians themselves, both in antiquity and today, call their country something entirely different in Arabic, Misr, a word of Semitic origin, notably also appearing in the Bible in reference to Egypt, and still the official Arabic name used in all internal documents and everyday speech. This kind of split between external and internal country names is fairly common worldwide, and Egypt is far from unique. The word Misr, incidentally, is also often used colloquially in the Cairene dialect for Cairo specifically, adding extra confusion even for Arabic speakers from other countries, roughly as if Moscow meant both the entire Soviet Union and one specific city, depending on context.
Now we reach the final block, closest to the present day, 20th and 21st century Egypt, where we'll try to stay maximally balanced and rely first on facts rather than political judgment, since many of these events remain the subject of live, ongoing debate within Egyptian society itself. Tellingly, views on this recent history vary a lot depending on who you ask. Older Egyptians who lived through the Nasser era often recall it nostalgically, as a time of national pride and social guarantees, while younger generations, raised in a different economic reality, often judge the same period far more critically, based on archival documents and later reassessment rather than direct experience. Worth saying up front, the closer we get to the present, the fewer clear, settled judgments remain, and the more we're dealing with live, unhealed public wounds. So our goal here isn't to hand down a verdict, but to honestly show the many-sidedness of events. Pop culture outside Egypt often flattens into a couple of textbook lines. Myth number 31.
The 1952 revolution that overthrew the monarchy, formally independent since 1922 when Britain, under pressure from a growing Egyptian nationalist movement, recognized nominal sovereignty while keeping control of defense and the Suez Canal, and brought to power a group of military officers led by the later famous Gamal Abdel Nasser, immediately and effortlessly brought Egypt prosperity, justice, and unambiguously positive change across every walk of life. The real picture of the Nasser era is far more mixed and layered. On one hand, the new Republican government carried out a genuinely sweeping and, in many ways, sincerely popular land reform, capping the maximum land holdings of a single family and redistributing surpluses to landless fellahin farmers who'd worked for decades on large estates under near-medieval tenancy, nationalized key sectors including banking and major industry, dramatically expanded free education up through university level and basic healthcare, and Nasser himself, thanks to his fiery anti-colonial rhetoric and the Suez triumph, became a genuine icon of pan-Arab nationalism far beyond Egypt's borders. His portraits could be found on walls from Morocco to Iraq, and his radio broadcasts drew whole families and neighborhoods around radios across the region. On the other hand, this same period saw a rigid one-party system with significant restrictions on political freedom and the press, and Egypt's crushing military defeat by Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War, costing the entire Sinai Peninsula and destroying much of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground within hours,
became a devastating national humiliation that seriously shook the previously optimistic image of the Nasser era. Nasser himself, despite the humiliation of 1967, announced his own resignation on live television. But it was rejected by millions of Egyptians who spontaneously took to the streets in support, forcing him to stay in office until his death from a heart attack in 1970. His Cairo funeral drew, by various estimates, up to 5 million people who spontaneously came out to see the leader off, one of the largest spontaneous displays of public grief of the 20th century, showing just how deeply his figure, for all the contradictions in how it's judged, is etched in popular memory.
Myth number 32. The decades-long conflict between Egypt and Israel ended with one simple final peace agreement, after which all related issues were permanently settled. The real path to peace was a much more complicated, multi-stage process. After the 1967 war came another major war in 1973, launched by Egypt together with Syria under President Anwar Sadat to reclaim the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And though militarily inconclusive for the Egyptian army, it psychologically and diplomatically paved the way for peace talks by restoring the country's national dignity after 1967's humiliation. The war's start date, October 6th, chosen deliberately for its symbolism during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan and coinciding with the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, is still a state holiday in Egypt today, and the Suez Canal Bridge Egyptian troops crossed became a major national symbol. The actual peace process, crowned by the historic 1978 Camp David Accords and the 1979 Peace Treaty, signed with direct mediation from President Jimmy Carter and making Egypt the first Arab country to formally recognize Israel, turned out for Sadat not to be a universal triumph but a deep rift within the Arab world. Egypt's temporary expulsion from the Arab League and, most tragically, ultimately cost him his life. He was assassinated in 1981 during a military parade marking the anniversary of the 1973 war by Islamist radicals among his own soldiers who rejected reconciliation with Israel. Sadat's figure remains one of the most contested in modern Egyptian history. Some remember him as the military leader of the 1973 war and architect of peace with Israel. Others as the ruler under whom the country began a major shift from Nasser's state economy toward a more open market model, known informally as infita, literally open door, whose effects, including rising inequality, are still felt today. Sadat's own turn from military rhetoric to diplomacy began with an unprecedented step. In 1977, he personally flew to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli Knesset, becoming the first Arab leader ever to make such a gesture, a move many contemporaries in Egypt and across the Arab world saw as shocking, bordering on betrayal of the shared Arab position on Palestine. Myth number 33. The 2011 popular revolution that overthrew longtime President Hosni Mubarak in mass protests at Cairo's Tahrir Square immediately established a stable, fully functioning Western-style democratic system in Egypt. The reality of the following years proved far more turbulent and disappointing for many who took part in those initial, largely spontaneous protests, which united under shared slogans of bread, freedom, and social justice extremely diverse parts of Egyptian society, from secular youth coordinating through social media to organized Islamist movements with far more developed local networks. The country's first genuinely free presidential elections did happen and brought to power Muslim Brotherhood member Mohamed Morsi. But his brief, just over a year presidency caused serious polarization and widespread discontent, leading within a year to fresh mass protests once again filling Tahrir Square, and subsequent military intervention removing Morsi from power. Events supporters called a necessary course correction, and critics called a military coup cutting, short a democratic process. Economics played no small role. Much of the discontent driving both Mubarak's fall and the later upheaval came not just from political freedom slogans, but from very down-to-earth problems. Rising prices on basic goods, youth unemployment, and local corruption, which ordinary citizens encountered far more often than high politics. The country's further political development over the past decade remains actively, sometimes fiercely, debated both within Egypt and among international observers regarding the balance between political stability, economic development, and civil freedoms. A complicated topic that can't be reduced to simple bad before the revolution, unambiguously good after, or vice versa. Tahrir Square itself, the worldwide symbol of those 18 days of protest, broadcast live around the world and turning Tahrir into a recognizable symbol of the Arab Spring, was, long before the revolution, one of the most ordinary, unremarkable traffic circles in downtown Cairo, and its name, literally meaning Liberation Square, dates to 1952, honoring the monarchy's overthrow, a historical coincidence many 2011 protesters saw as a symbolic echo between two revolutionary. Myth number 34. Modern Egypt's system of government is, in essence and structure, practically identical to the power model that existed in the country back in pharaonic times, as if nothing has changed in this regard for thousands of years. This catchy, often repeated phrase about unchanging Egypt sounds nice, but is historically pretty superficial and misleading. The modern Egyptian state is a perfectly ordinary, by 21st century standards, republic with a formal constitution, parliament, judicial system, and all the other institutions of a modern nation-state. A concept itself a relatively recent historical invention, only really taking shape in the 19th and 20th centuries, and completely alien to the ancient world of the pharaohs, with its sacred, deified monarchy, where the ruler was officially the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus on earth, not a head of state in the modern legal sense, elected or appointed by formal procedure and accountable to any institution beyond his own divine will. That said, a certain long-term historical continuity in Egypt's relationship to strong, centralized state power, and the Nile's special role as the country's organizing economic backbone, really does trace across millennia. But that reflects long-term geographic and historical patterns driven by the need to centrally manage a single river's irrigation system, not a literal, unchanging identity of the political system, as if rulers simply changed names while power's essence stayed frozen for millennia. Interestingly, the Nile itself, once the absolute center of the ancient state's economic life, today sits at the center of a new, thoroughly modern diplomatic knot. Construction of a major dam upstream in Ethiopia has, in recent years, caused serious concern in Egypt, historically dependent on stable Nile flow, and become the subject of tense multilateral negotiations, showing that even thousands of years later, the geopolitics of this ancient waterway are far from settled. Before the very last myth, one more small detour that illustrates today's overall lesson well. Almost every era of Egyptian history we've discussed today, from the Ptolemies to Nasser, felt to people living through it at the time like ordinary current politics, not history in the lofty textbook sense, and only decades or centuries later hardened into a frozen chapter. Another detail that regularly surprises visitors: Egypt's official weekend is traditionally Friday, the holy day of Muslim communal prayer, rather than Sunday, with Saturday also often a non-working day, making Friday-Saturday the functional equivalent of a Western weekend, while Sunday remains a perfectly ordinary working and school day. A similar pattern shows up in sports. Beyond soccer, unquestionably the country's most popular sport with a huge, passionate fan culture around the major Cairo clubs, Egypt has also historically been strong in squash, producing world-class champions for decades and remaining one of the world's leading squash nations, a pleasant surprise for outsiders who associate the country purely with soccer or, at best, Red Sea diving. Also worth mentioning, the Coptic diaspora, a significant part of which has emigrated abroad over recent decades, mainly to North America, Europe, and Australia, building active religious, cultural, and professional communities that today often play a notable role preserving and promoting Coptic heritage outside Egypt itself, including funding new churches and cultural centers abroad, sometimes more actively than at home. Another rarely mentioned detail: beyond Arabic, a significant share of educated, older generation Egyptians still speak decent French, not just English, a legacy of the same period of intense European cultural contact in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when French, not English, remained for a long time the language of the aristocracy and diplomacy, before gradually losing ground to English in the second half of the 20th century. Worth mentioning, too, Egypt's role in the Cold War-era non-aligned movement, alongside India and Yugoslavia, one of its key founders, seeking to balance between the two superpowers without joining either bloc, a serious foreign policy statement of independence for a country under direct British colonial control barely a decade earlier. The movement's founding conference, held in 1955 in the Indonesian city of Bandung with Nasser as one of the key speakers, was later seen by historians as a symbolic birth moment for the so-called Third World, as its own pole in world politics. And now we arrive at the last 35th myth, which brings us back to where we started today's journey. Many assume that because Egypt is so firmly associated with pyramids and pharaohs in the world's popular imagination, the ancient pharaonic era must have made up the overwhelming majority of this remarkable country's history. But now, armed with everything we've covered today, you understand how deceptive this compressed sense of time can be, since the human brain, it turns out, is remarkably bad at intuitively grasping spans of time far longer than a few lifetimes strung together, which is why any era older than a couple centuries tends to blur together in most people's minds into one indistinguishable long, long ago. Remember the fact we opened with? Cleopatra, whom popular imagination firmly files under ancient Egypt, lived closer in time to us, to the age of moon landings, than to the moment the Great Pyramid was built. Just over 2,000 years have passed since Cleopatra took the throne, roughly the same span separating us from the birth of Julius Caesar, her contemporary and lover, who himself, in our minds, is also firmly filed under deep, frozen antiquity, even though technically he's closer to us in time than most of the pharaonic era was to him. And after Cleopatra's own death, Egypt lived through almost exactly as much more historical time, under Roman, Byzantine, and Arab rule, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and finally, as a modern independent state, as had passed from the start of the Pyramid era to Cleopatra herself, cycling through at least 5 completely different religions and worldviews along the way, from ancient polytheism through Christianity to Islam, showing just how alive and changing Egyptian identity has stayed across its entire long history. In other words, that familiar image of Ancient Egypt, with its pyramids and pharaohs, which we usually picture as one single monolithic thing, actually makes up only about half of this incredibly long, varied history. And the other half? Every bit as eventful, full of Greeks, Romans, Arabs, revolutions, and modern upheaval, usually stays deep in the shadow of one recognizable triangular silhouette against a desert sunset.
Even though this less publicized second half often turns out to be every bit as fascinating as the pharaohs themselves. The 35 stories we've covered today are, of course, far from a complete list of everything the world still believes about Egypt. But hopefully, enough